With fair housing, a licensee violation would bring about sanctions and fines and civil penalties, and in some cases, criminal penalties. They what these laws serve to do is create a safety net, particularly for protected classes. And we're going to talk about who is a protected class and who is not a protected class. So all real estate professionals need to become acquainted with these types of discriminatory and unfair practices. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was really the first sweeping act of legislation, imperfect though it was, that worked toward eliminating discrimination. And the law specifically stated that all citizens of any race and color, except Indians, of the United States shall have the same right in every state and territory as is enjoyed by white citizens thereof to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property. This, however, did not include women. So we were talking about men. It wasn't until the 70s, and we'll look at the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, where women were finally allowed to get their own credit cards, to own property themselves. Not until the 1970s did women begin having these rights. And because the shift occurred, laws developed saying that you can't ask women about particular income. You can't say, are you getting child support? Are you on federal funding? Are you getting alimony? A person can disclose that information willingly to use it as part of an application for a financial package, but lenders are specifically prohibited from asking about sources of income like that. And that those are part of the evolution in those discriminatory, eliminating some of those discriminatory practices. About 100 years later, 1968 more specifically, the second version, the updated version of the Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress and prohibited racial discrimination in the leasing and financing of property. So that's different than just owning property, right? And that was known as the Fair Housing Act. And these laws and the Americans with Disability Act all stemmed, let's say, from these two sweeping pieces of legislation. The Fair Housing Act was much more stringent and inclusive. And it continues to be refined to include other protected classes. We know what that looks like is changing. The case that you want to know really is Jones versus Meyer. So in 1968, a Supreme Court ruling held that a private individual couldn't discriminate in selling or renting real property because of race. Jones versus Meyer. And the issue that came before the court was whether the statute that was passed in 1866 applied to private parties or only to state action. And the court ruled that Congress had, the power to abolish certain types of things, and that enacting fair housing laws was part and parcel of continuing to abolish slavery. the logic follows. And it made a really sharp distinction between the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, which applied to more than racial discrimination. They applied to steering and blockbusting and redlining, three very, very, very key terms, which we'll talk about. So when the Civil Rights Act of 1968, this fair housing, broadened what classes were protected, it also contained several exemptions. Exemptions are given to certain residential properties that relate to the sale or rental of a single family home. So that's 1 to 4 units. But to qualify for an exemption, all of the following conditions must be met. All of the following have to be in place. The home has to be owned privately, so no business ownership, no partnerships. The owner doesn't own more than 3 single family dwellings. I can't even imagine owning 3 single family dwellings. And the owner does not occupy the dwelling or was its most recent inhabitant. Those are the exemptions. If the exemption qualifies, it only does so if for selling, if the homeowner doesn't use the services of a real estate professional, because a licensee, of course, is bound by these laws. It doesn't advertise using wording that is discriminatory toward any protected class, and the rental of rooms or units, provided that the owner maintains one of the unit as a resident. And that's also a property management question. When we encounter a question that talks about someone living on the property and maintaining it in exchange for rent or something like that, that's an exemption. And then the other situations that would qualify for exemptions, transactions involving religious organizations outside of commercial purposes, again, provided that religious membership isn't based on race, color, sex, national origin, and private clubs for the exact same reason. Now, in 1974, the laws were amended to include sex discrimination. And this is what we were speaking to just a moment ago, because at that point, women were, they found they were actively being discriminated against by being denied loans for housing. And then those laws were amended again in 1988, to include familial status, which means persons living or expected to live with children under the age of 18. Couldn't discriminate on that either. National origin was included to protect immigrants who found themselves the target of unfair discriminatory practices. Interesting, considering that immigrants have never been treated fairly in this country. Without getting political, these laws try to address that, and I'm not sure how successful we are, but the ideal is sound and is good. Other persons who are protected under the law: people with impairments, hearing visual impairments, disabilities, those with HIV or AIDS, which in a few years, I wonder if that's even going to be listed anymore, because that's something that's seems to be on the way to being eradicated. People with cognitive or intellectual impairments, mental health diagnoses, those recovering from addiction to drugs or alcohol. So a question may be worded about who those protected classes are. The key with the drugs and alcohol question is recovery and rehabilitation, rehab. So those two components have to be there for them to be a protected class. And those who are not disabled but may live or take care of someone with a disability. All states, of course, have to comply with the federal law, although they can do, we can do one higher and better. We're always, states are given the latitude to have a better standard. But one of the really important aspects of that 68 law is that the most stringent law takes priority, and any persons that are considered to be a protected class have all the same protections as federal classes. Regarding a protected class, it's illegal to do any of the following. You can't refuse to negotiate rent or sell to a person who has made a genuine bona fide offer. You can't deny or make housing unavailable. You can't fail to consider or accept an offer. Not saying it doesn't happen. Even if we don't see overt bias, we all know that unconscious bias and subtle bias exist. But again, this tries to address what that looks like for protected classes using different application criteria, impose different rental charges or prices. You can't evict someone based on that. You can't advertise or make statements that indicate limitation that are discriminatory, and you can't disallow any individual from inspecting a property that's available for sale or rent. So those are the protections that were put into place at that point. And they also provide additional protections for consumers by making sure that commercial lenders didn't get to deny lendees. They did not get to create different terms or conditions for different populations and different individuals. And it further specified that it would be illegal to deny anyone use or participation in real estate services like the multiple listing service, brokers organizations. And it outlawed types of practices that were very, very commonly used at the time. Redlining comes to mind. The 3 testable items on your material discussing illegal practices encompass steering, redlining, and blockbusting. Now, steering can be incredibly subtle. And I think in the field of real estate, it's so important to continue to re-examine the ways that we might be biased just because of how we grew up. I mean, everybody has these unconscious stereotypes, right? We all do. We know that some people will examine those and look at that, and others have no desire to do that, or in the other vein, maybe actively racist or sexist, misogynist, whatever that looks like. But I think the subtle stuff creates a lot larger problem, because it's the practice of directing home seekers toward or away from particular neighborhoods based on race, color, sex, religion, national origin, whether someone has a disability, ageism, whatever that may look like. And because otherwise well-intentioned people even don't necessarily stop to examine their motives, then unconscious steering happens a lot more than people think. And one of our moral and ethical obligations, at least as I see it, and so does the ethics committee, is that we have to empower our clients in every single way possible, which means they're in the driver's seat. We need to allow them to direct us. And there are a lot of ways we have to change our language and just the way we communicate in order to do that. A lot of explaining, not a lot of directing, if that makes sense. Not just knowing the contracts and your information, but understanding that no, you can't just give them that information, but you can give them every tool and resource to utilize so that they can cultivate that information for themselves and then direct you. That empowers your client. We never really know what is going on inside of someone's framework. And once I understood that steering or purposefully not steering is not only a skill and requires a lot of self-awareness, but in fact squarely puts the choice for everything in your client's lap. When I got into real estate, steering made sense as a concept, I think, for me, but I bumped against it a little bit, and here's why. It's because were I to ever dip my toe into residential real estate, which that'd have to be a pretty extraordinary situation, my inclination would be to work with underserved populations and further put them in the very safest possible place, right? You know, where's a place where your kids aren't going to get beat up going to school and things like that. The problem with that is I can't truly know what that might look like for them. And because we are also dealing with people who are some of them in the middle of the biggest transaction of their life, that makes it equally important that not only you provide them all the information that they need on federal laws, you know, you're their oversight, you're their advocate, you're their protector, you know, against the system, but you stand between them and the system essentially. But that the choice in where they purchase real property is truly their own, because we don't know. And when that finally sunk in for me, and I saw it, not unlike in mediation, you know, empowering the sides to be able to communicate and grow their knowledge to create a best case scenario. The same kind of applies here. So licensees just have to really guard against unintentionally steering clients based on their own perceptions and stereotypes, and never assume what they need or want. And in fact, your first meeting or two with a client, you should probably be listening about 3 to 4 times as much as you talk, and ask questions. Tons and tons and tons of questions. The more familiar you become with the individual or parties that you're working with, the better able you will be to meet them where they are, and not have to have them meet you. Blockbusting used to be known as panic peddling, and it's what it means is to induce panic in a neighborhood for financial gain. We see it typically, and so I mean it's still, it's not that it's not still present, but it used to be rampant. the field of real estate in particular was such a good old boys club, and everybody was paying everybody else off, and all these kickbacks. There was a time when the field of real estate was largely unregulated. But when a person or entity coerces essentially someone to sell their property for less than its value by saying things with religious, racial, or economic undertones, so targeting race and class and religion, and basically saying, yeah, you don't want this is going to cause your property values to decrease. And we saw that when Black families started moving into white, upper middle class white neighborhoods, middle class and upper middle class white neighborhoods. There was a huge response to that in the market, property values dropping, because people didn't want others or people who were different in their neighborhoods. And anyone, any person or entity that would reinforce those fears, saying, oh, your property values are going to decrease, your local services are going to decline, education's going to decline, crime rates are going to increase, anything like that is known as blockbusting. And then what happens is these people or entities would buy those homes and then sell them to incoming residents at a higher rate. So that's blockbusting, and it's pretty disgusting. And redlining is where a lender refuses to make loans, or they place certain restrictions on specific areas without considering that applicant's qualifications. It literally means, say this is a map, drew a line or drew a circle around particular areas that say, we're going to refuse this person a loan because of a crime rate or ethnicity or source of funds or marriage or familial status or any other discriminatory criteria that would otherwise make them qualified. So, all right, those are your precursor points. And we are going to just take like a 5-10 minute break, nothing big. Then, because then we're going to hit Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm going to provide, we'll just run down a summary of key points. And I've provided a quiz. And if you can take it immediately when our session is over, you have the document to look up any information if for some reason you need to do that. That way, if you need clarification, you can let me know. But if you get these down, these federal laws, and then it's like contracts and agency, and then when you go back to your settlement and closing items, then you're going to do better. You'll do better with the closing disclosure. You'll do better with things like trigger terms, understanding trigger terms, which page 5 of your closing disclosure, top of the page, those are your trigger terms. But questions too that you're asked about accessibility and adaptability are pretty specific. And you'll be able to answer those without having to go back and review and review and review and review. So it will be good movement forward. And I'm sorry, I'm a little slow in my thoughts and speech. I had to take some allergy medication earlier, so this is where we are. And finally, we'll talk just a little bit about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act before we do our summary of key points. There is a nod to RESPA and TILA in your federal laws document, but because I sent RESPA TILA review material separately, there's only just a nod to the RESPA TILA in here. And remember, I just say this over and over, on your test, because we tend to forget things we just know. It's kind of like the debit credit thing, that RESPA and TILA, RESPA is regulation X, TILA is regulation Z, R before T, X before Z. That way, if you see it in regulation X or regulation Z form, you can go back and remember what is being talked about. All right, we will come back in 10 minutes and do that last 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. And that should be a good good blast. I'll be interested to see how you are answering your questions when you're testing, if that material will become a little more will come a little more easily to you. But these are all really germane, important points, and kind of the more we hammer them, the more likely you are to remember them and not have to struggle for the information on the test. So the purpose of the Americans with Disability Act, or the ADA as we'll refer to it from here on out, is to eliminate discrimination against people that had disabilities and allow them to enter the mainstream in a way that they could access and enjoy, at least this is the ideal, access and enjoy activities in the social and economic mainstream that quote unquote normal people could enjoy all the time. But this includes equal opportunity, transportation, employment, communications, access to goods and services. All of those items are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. With the passage of that Fair Housing Amendment in '88, when Congress prohibited discrimination against those with physical or mental disabilities and housing, it didn't apply to any type of real property other than housing. In 1990, when Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act that prohibited that discrimination and targeted transportation and employment and state and local government services, outlined what that looked like, including, and this is the testable stuff right here, refusing to permit reasonable modifications to a property if those changes are necessary to provide full enjoyment. Keep in mind, the lessor, so someone who is renting the property, may require some of those modifications to be made at the owner's expense, or at the tenant's expense, excuse me, and require those modifications to be approved and the tenant to reasonably restore the premises upon termination of that lease. Accessibility and adaptability are the two terms as far as vocabulary and the parameters for defining fair housing. And these relate only to multifamily dwellings, which is more than 4 units, whose construction was completed after March of 1991. Readily accessible simply means that any disabled patron or employee will be able to access, enter, and use the facility, even if that structure can't be, even if not all of it can be made accessible. The general rule of thumb is the first floor must be accessible, but if there's an elevator, all units must be accessible that are on that elevator path. So if you're in a multifamily housing complex and there are 4 floors with an elevator, all 4 floors, all of those units have to be accessible. The test for adaptability means that the units which are required to be accessible must also be adapted for the handicapped. What that is going to look like on your test is that environmental controls and electrical outlets and sources must be reachable from a wheelchair. The wheelchair can get through all the doorways. Bathroom walls must be reinforced in a way that grab bars can be installed if they need to be. Kitchens and bathrooms must contain enough space to allow a wheelchair to move in a way that doesn't limit the tenant's ability to utilize the necessary space. That is the exact specific criteria. And all brokerage firms have to comply with those federal state fair housing laws. And when you are observing buildings, just even from now on, when you go into a location, look for stuff like this, because I think it's very easy to not notice it. Although we're all a little bit older, and the likelihood of us having taken care of or known or been close to someone with a disability, we do intrinsically understand that even with these laws in place, it still is incredibly difficult to navigate. But if you can come into real estate with that type of perspective taking, it is going to serve you so well with your clients. Many of the folks that you represent, even if they don't have an overt physical handicap, may have a lot of other things going on that you wouldn't see right from the get-go. But if you come at it from the perspective of accessibility and adaptability, you will always serve your clients well, always. The penalties for violating fair housing laws are severe. And enforcement is not a joke, particularly when it comes to lenders and people with fiduciary duties. The penalties are huge. So fines, and of course this extends to property management companies and things like that. The fines that can incur are up to $75,000 just for a first offense. So when we see, say, multifamily housing units or companies get hammered for offenses, it takes a dozen offenses, and that's $1 million right there, just in the fines incurred. And there are also pretty severe criminal penalties for those who coerce or threaten or intimidate or interfere with a person when they buy, sell, lease, rent. We talk about the term undue influence. That is one of those ways that coercion occurs, and that's specifically why it's named, is because, like menace and duress, it's a form of bullying. It's just financial in nature, and we don't see it just in institutional laws. That's the bigger picture, is the institutional portion of it. But we often see it in relationships which are financially unequal, and one person has control of the pocketbook and uses that control as to either manipulate, to withhold, or take away. And so that is also, in a way, undue influence. And when you think about it on that type of scale, it will help you see that the way it's done on an institutional level is just a reflection on the way it happens on a personal level. It goes all the way down from the institution, all the way down, and inundates our culture. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, 1974, focused on this discrimination being practiced by lenders. I'm going to keep going back to this one again and again. Did two things. One, part of its educational purpose was to educate people on credit, cost of borrowing credit, but it even extended to property managers checking the credit of prospective tenants. So it makes it illegal to discriminate when granting credit based on age or marital status. Going back to, this is when women were starting to be allowed institutionally to have credit cards, to own property. Almost, 85 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And a lender is specifically not allowed to make any verbal or written statement which would discourage a reasonable individual from submitting an application for a loan. That's why they are forbidden to inquire about child support, alimony, unless those are voluntarily disclosed, and the individual wants to use that as part of their application. Utah specifically, Utah state law, fair housing laws prohibit discrimination in lending based on the source of funds like public assistance. That's a Utah specific law. And over time, then, because of these policies, the laws governing regulations X and Z, RESPA and TILA started streamlining. They started lining up, and that's when those disclosures started to become integrated, RESPA, TILA. Now we kind of see them all as one long integrated document, which they should be. That's ideal. In your federal laws A, be sure that you go over just the basics with the TILA and advertising and the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, because in this particular document, I just gave a nod. Again, the RESPA TILA chapters flesh out what that looks like. And when you are looking at your Rep C and closing disclosure, it's always a good idea to review the summary of key points in those RESPA TILA documents, just the summary of key points, because when you do that, and I remember this day very, very well, that the closing disclosure and the Rep C and the RESPA TILA laws clicked for me. And it's because I was looking at them together. And one day I just looked at the closing disclosure and I was like, this is just beautifully laid out. I got it. I was like, wow, what a simple document. And same with the Rep C. I think it was my dad, my broker, who said when he spoke that in Utah, we have only a 6-page Rep C, and it is very, very well written. We're lucky to be working with a document that has so many safeguards and protections and very few ways to make loopholes, to create loopholes with it. So if you do that, or you're feeling confused on your closing disclosure, when it comes to the federal laws, look at that truth in lending stuff. Also, when you're looking at your closing disclosure, that Utah settlement chapter that I sent out that we spoke about earlier, keep that by you, because the language we talked about on page 2 and 3, paid before closing, at closing, cash to close, page 3, paid by or on behalf of the borrower at, that's the language that's going to cue you about how you're going to answer the test questions. Keep that Utah settlement document by you. That way, if you look at a line item and you kind of freeze up when you're quizzing, go back and look at the description of that line item. All of these will help you, because there are tons of Rep C and closing disclosure questions on the exam, of course. And it's not about memorizing the document. It's far easier to look at the document, look at that explanation, look at the document again, and then see a context for it, so that because even if we kind of know something, under testing conditions, we have roadblocks in our memory sometimes. But the more you do that, and the more you see kind of a bigger picture, the less your brain is going to have to search for the details. And I think that's where a lot of people get messed up, because then you start to run out of time. And that creates further anxiety. And let's just not do that. We'll talk about settlement, closing, and res ventila as much as we want, because it, along with the contracts and agency, constitutes about 1/3 of your exam overall, as far as what that looks like. Also why I really wanted to put a particular push on fair housing and ADA stuff, so that, again, that bigger picture starts to coalesce. And when you go back into the exam, you look at the document and just be like, well, yeah, I know this document. This is okay. A lot of the items, particularly on the closing disclosure, are very line item specific. You just have to know what you're looking for, is all. Okay, you have 2 testable pieces of material. I'm going to hit this summary of key points. Both quizzes contain answer keys. Now, your Federal Laws B are also in there. That document is also in there. We did not cover that tonight, but I would encourage you to read the summary of key points, test on the material, and then go back and use the text in the material to see what you missed. And if you need further clarification, I'm always happy to have a discussion about it. Always, always, always. So Civil Rights Act 1866 prohibited discrimination based on race or color in the sale or lease of residential or commercial property. Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination with housing. The sale and rental of housing included, and the related services like lending. The law, when it was amended, prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, color, sex, national origin, familial status, and mental or physical handicap or disability. Blockbusting, inducing or attempting to induce for profit owners of properties to sell or rent by bad-mouthing those of a particular race or color, or whatever other group that is. Steering is restricting or moving up, restricting moving away a person or party away or toward a particular area, whether in conduct or word, subtle or overt. I would like to say that a lot of it, most of it, is subtle and not done with an awareness. So it's not malicious, it's not purposeful, it's just still disempowering. And then redlining is when a lender refuses to make or provide information about residential mortgage loans, imposes different criteria or conditions for different groups or people, including discriminating in property appraisal. I mean, it filters all the way down. ADA was passed to guarantee those with mental or physical disabilities had access to the same services when it came to employment and transportation, etc., that those who did not. And the law prohibited public accommodations to discriminate against anyone based on a disability. And that includes the former drug user, drug addict that we talk about. Remember, the caveat on that protection is that they are either recovering or out of rehab. So on your test, those are going to be the criteria for that. And the same law also requires that any new construction, so anything after March of 1991, has to be designed to be readily accessible unless it will be structurally incredibly impractical to do so. They don't really build public buildings like that anymore, fortunately. I would also, when you're looking through the rest of your federal laws, look at the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's important because it talks about price fixing. The Sherman Antitrust Act is on your test. Only 1 or 2 questions, but you'll want to know that it's basically a self-regulatory act that keeps brokerage fees stable. It doesn't allow them to wildly fluctuate so that it promotes an open marketplace. The Uniform Commercial Code, you will want to just take a glance at that. There might be 1 or 2 questions. And the Environmental Protection Agency and what an environmental impact report is. When I do my microblast scheduled for Monday, I'm going to microblast the remaining items in Federal Laws B, and then you can kind of put all of that together. And the I'll send you the link, because all videos at this point that are edited out and not super small group, but all those microblasts and stuff like that are all going to be public. So that you can just go in and you don't have to mess with, I need the link, I need the video. I've thought about this for a long time, and Amy's been my guinea pig, but she's the one who kind of really came up with the microblast. And I've tested it out several times, and it is super effective. So I'm going to keep going toward that end, and give you those bursts of testable material in a way you can understand. And if there's a mnemonic or something silly that goes with it that will help you remember it, I have no problems making a fool out of myself to do that. It'll be a good time. Any questions? Well, all right then.
Did you say, I'm sorry, the study hall link YouTube channel, is that, you're going to resend that to us? With
I will, because
Okay.
making and you can get to it through the agency A and B video I sent you.
Okay.
Because if you go to that one, because that was the first one that I